Hi and welcome back. In this video, we're going to continue with our student class and we're going to look at the average function. So in the last video, we discovered that when we call a class, that creates a blank object and that gets passed to the dunder init method as self. And then we can modify that by creating new variables inside that blank object. That's how these things here end up with a name property. And I just said property, and let's start calling things by what they are. When we define a variable inside an object, that's no longer a variable, now it's called a property of the object. Similarly, when we define a function like this average function inside a class, that is no longer called a function, that is now called a method. Same thing, it's just a different name in order for when you talk about programming to be able to quickly differentiate between what you're talking about. So student 1 and student 2 know that they are students. They are of type student, because that's the way that this was created when we called the class. Therefore, because they're of type student, they know that they have this average function inside of them. Now, we can call student1.average. We're calling the average function which is inside of our student1. Now, you can see that there's a self parameter here, which we are clearly not fulfilling. So, what do you think is going to happen when we print this out? Let's run it. And we get a value, and a valid one at that. So why is that? Well, Python is pretty smart. And when you use an object to call a function of the class, it automatically populates self as the object that called that function. Okay, let me give you another example that you may understand a bit more easily. Let's call the function, the method here in the class. The way that you'd sort of expect to do that is by saying student, which is the class, dot, to access something inside of it, average. Right? We've got the class, we access something inside of it, and what we're accessing is the average function. However, if we do this, and we run it, now we see that it says something not very readable. Average, the average function, is missing one required argument, which is self. So Python obviously cannot tell what object you want to get the average of, because you've not called it with an object, you've called it with the class, which is the definition of an object. So what to do is to pass in a particular object. Oh, not my student, that's a dictionary. Student1. Now, when you call this, student1 will be self, as normal in Python functions, and you will return that. So we can once again run it, and now you can see we get the correct value. When you do student1.average, Python in the background is doing this. So there's no magic going on whatsoever. It's just that in order to save you from typing a bunch of stuff, you can just call it on the student. And that also sort of makes sense. Because now you're getting the average of student1, you don't have to include the student class in there, Self gets automatically populated for you when you call any method. Remember, that's a function within a class with the student as the caller. And the student here is the caller, because that's where we're calling this function from. Okay, that's what this is called. Okay, so let's think about this average method again. We've got student1 being passed as self, and we must remember now that student1 was this object that was created emptily here, also called self, but that's just a side effect of the naming conventions in Python. Student1 is the self thing here, and we know it has a name, and it also has a grades. So when we access student1.grades, that is what we passed initially up here. And here we're also accessing student1.grades. However, in order to make this a bit more generic, we're not using average only on student1, but on self. Because we define self.grades, we know that we have self.grades available to use in the average function. So we can use self.grades and self.grades, and it depends on which student object we call it on, that is going to use either these grades if we call it with student1, or these grades if we call it with student2. We can rewrite this function entirely, by the way, down here, by making it accept a student, and it's going to return the sum of student.grades and the length of student.grades. Okay. We're going to print student1.grades. And then we're going to call the average function call of student1. The first thing we're going to do is print out the student's grades, which we know should be 70, 80, 90, and 99. And indeed, there we get them here. Then we define this function that takes in a student object, returns the sum of its grades property, the one we just printed up here, and the length, and divides one by another. Then we call that function with our student1 object, passed in as an argument. So student1, this is student1, this is student1, student1.grades is the same thing we just printed up here. And student1.grades is the same thing we printed up here. And then that is how the average gets calculated. Again, just to recap, when you call student1.average, what's happening in the background is student.average student1. Student1 is being passed as self. Same function we just defined, only the parameter is called self. Again, you could call this student if you wanted. But it is not common to do that. Normally, in methods, the first parameter is always called self because it refers to the object that you're currently modifying or acting on. Okay, and that's how that works. That's how the methods work. And now we're able to both define the data that we're acting on and the action we're performing in the same structure. Now it's a class instead of a dictionary, but essentially it's the same thing. It allows us to store some data, and now it extends that functionality by allowing us to store some functions that act on that data as well. Now, of course, the average function could receive some extra arguments, some extra parameters, if you wanted, just as the dunder init method does. So you could pass in some name as well if you wanted, and then student1.average now would just get something, a friend, some argument there as well. That would be the second argument, the second parameter. Okay, so self is populated first by the current object. Any other parameters get populated after from whatever it is inside these brackets. Anyway, I think I've gone on and on about this enough. Hopefully it's more or less clear that a student class is just something that allows us to define what properties are in a student and also what actions a student can do on its own data, or indeed, if we so desired, on other data by passing in some arguments. So that's what a class is. That's also an object is, a way to store some data and store some actions that relate to it. That allows us to encapsulate and hold all relevant functionality in the same structure as opposed to having it split over two separate structures like we did up here. So that's it for this video. Hopefully that's clear. And over the coming sections, we're going to be using this more and more. And as you program more and more, it's going to sort of become second nature. And you're going to start understanding this a bit more thoroughly. And I'm sure it will get better and better. If you are confused, please ask a question in the course Q&A. We'll be happy to help you. But it normally takes a few months to fully click. So, of course, I'm going to try to get that to click earlier by providing with good explanations. But if you are just, mildly uncomfortable with all this, that's fine. Just keep going, keep programming, keep writing code, and it's going to all settle down in your subconscious as you move along. So that's it for this video. I'll see you on the next one.